All right. Well, welcome to Pants on Fire. And today we're joined by Duncan, and I want to welcome Duncan to the podcast. Welcome, Duncan.
Thank you, Kyle.
So let's start by just letting me know a little bit about your background and your experience with China. And then today we'll be discussing the One China policy.
Okay, well, I was an anti-war activist in the 1960s. That's how I became interested in Asia and Vietnam, and from there, China. And I first visited China in 1981 with the U.S.-China People's Friendship Association. And I have visited China. Over the years, I visited China 17 times. I actually worked organizing exchanges with China in the 1980s. I was editor of U.S.-China Review for a couple of years. That's the journal of the Friendship Association. And the last time I was in China actually was in 2017. So that's and currently I am I'm the chairperson of the Asia-Pacific Subcommittee of the Peace and Solidarity Commission, CPUSA. Those
Excellent.
are brief words.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on to talk about this. I know it's a big topic, and so I'm going to just let you introduce the topic and give us a little historical background on what is the One China question, or the One China. First of all, is it the One China policy, or is it the One China question? What is the proper term, and what is it all about?
Well, the One China policy concerns the Taiwan as part of China. I would like to read briefly from the Taiwan White Paper, which was issued by the Taiwan Affairs Office of the People's Republic of China in last August, because I think it's important to hear from China itself, at least as a starter, about the One China policy. So here I'm quoting from the Taiwan White Paper. Quotes, "We Chinese will decide our own affairs. The Taiwan question is an internal affair that involves China's core interests and the Chinese people's national sentiments, and no external interference will be tolerated. Any attempt to use the Taiwan question as a pretext to interfere in China's internal affairs or obstruct China's reunification will meet with resolute opposition of the Chinese people, including our compatriots in Taiwan. No one should underestimate our resolve, will, and ability to defend China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We will work with the greatest sincerity and exert our utmost efforts to achieve a peaceful reunification. But we will not renounce the use of force, and we will reserve the option of taking all necessary measures. This is to guard against external interference in all separatist activities. In no way does it target our fellow Chinese in Taiwan. Some forces in the U.S. are making every effort to incite groups inside Taiwan to stir up trouble and use Taiwan as a pawn against China. This has jeopardized peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits, obstructed the Chinese government's efforts towards peaceful reunification. The U.S. should abide by the One China principle, deal with Taiwan-related issues in a prudent and proper manner, stand by the previous commitments, and stop supporting Taiwan separatists." And so that's a brief summary of what the government of China in Beijing is saying on Taiwan and the One China principle.
Wow. Thanks for doing that. That quote, I think, speaks volumes to what the issue, what it is, what it's all about, and kind of the stance that China takes. And when they're referring to outside interference, I think one could draw the line that they're talking about imperialism and imperialist efforts by the West.
Well, yeah, the West, but in particular, the United States. So you want me to give you a brief history on this?
Yeah. So what's the deal with Taiwan and China, and how is the U.S. involved?
Okay, well, if very brief background. I mean, Taiwan island was originally settled thousands and thousands of years ago by, there's an indigenous population similar to, I think, many of the islands in the Pacific. Now, China itself, Taiwan being, located near the mainland of China, the Chinese themselves began contact, according to the white paper, in the 3rd century. But in following dynasties, the Sung dynasty and so forth, in the 17th century, as the European colonialists moved into East Asia, Dutch actually created a settlement on Taiwan, but they were driven out by the Qing dynasty, and the Qing actually incorporated Taiwan as part of Fujian province, which is across the Taiwan Straits. And then later in the 19th century, it became a province of China. So the Taiwan issue in modern history really began with the Sino-Japanese War in 1894, 1895, when Japan defeated China and inflicted unequal treaties and annexed Taiwan as part of the Japanese Empire. Now, during World War II, China, of course, fought Japan, was an ally of the U.S. and the West. And it was agreed in all the World War II sort of summit meetings, for example, in Cairo, that all of Japanese territories that they had conquered from China would be returned to China. And the U.S. agreed to that. Mm-hmm. There was no Taiwan issue. I mean, it was in the United Nations, which was founded in 1945. Taiwan was considered part of China. Nobody ever thought to question it until the Communist Party led the Revolution of Victory in China in 1949. Even then, President Truman said that the U.S. would not intervene in any issue concerning Taiwan. However, with the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, the U.S. sent the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Straits to protect Chiang Kai-shek, who had fled to Taiwan as the losing party in the Chinese Civil War. So the whole idea of an independent Taiwan, or one China, one Taiwan, or whatever, is really a creation of U.S. imperialism. At the time, it militarily intervened in the Chinese Civil War. So that's why the U.S. has a special responsibility here. It really created the whole Taiwan issue.
So it goes back a long way, and really the Chinese Civil War, which kind of started, was World War II still going on when the Chinese Civil War started? Or was it shortly after?
Well, the Chinese Civil War actually started in the 1930s with the communist-led armies fighting the Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek-led armies. However, in 1937, at the initiative of the Communist Party, a national front to resist the Japanese invasion was declared. And so the Chinese Civil War was, at least in theory, sort of put on hold in terms of the subsequent period during World War II, when all of China was fighting Japan. After World War II, despite the peace initiatives of the Communist Party, the Chinese Civil War started up again in 1946 with the U.S. backing the right-wing capitalist Kuomintang forces.
Yeah. So that was like the nationalist party that was fighting against the Communist Party. And of course, the U.S. backed the nationalists, because that's kind of what we historically do. So that's interesting that the Civil War, they were fighting this war, but during the time when Japan was invading, they kind of put it on hold to kind of join forces, and everybody was fighting the Japanese.
Yeah, they created a national united front against the Japanese invasion. Now, the Kuomintang was kind of duplicitous. They did fight the Japanese. On the other hand, they also fought the communists. So they were sort of realized that the communists were a major threat to their power. But the Chinese people demanded a united front against the Japanese invasion. And so that was the policy at that time. Now, under the Roosevelt administration, the U.S. had a much smarter policy where it did not take sides in the Chinese Civil War, but it had a sort of even-handed approach. And actually, many ties at that time were created by the U.S. military and U.S. journalists covering the war and the Chinese Communist Party, which would have been the basis of good relations, which Mao Zedong always said he wanted good relations with the U.S. However, those people who had a very realistic attitude about the situation in China, they were all suppressed during the McCarthy period, kicked out of the State Department, considered traitors, and so forth. So things degenerated in the Truman administration.
So the history of, I guess, the idea of Taiwan independence was around that time, and it was sort of created by the U.S. because they were backing the separatists, the Nationalist Party that lost in the Civil War.
Right. So the U.S. actually recognized the Republic of China as the sole legitimate government of China during the 1950s and 1960s, and it refused to recognize the PRC, the People's Republic of China. However, that changed. And people probably know about Kissinger's visit and Nixon's visit to China in 1971, 1972, which led to the restoration of diplomatic relations. But the fundamental political requirement that China put forward in terms of normalizing relations was for the United States to de-recognize Taiwan as the government of China and recognize that the People's Republic in Beijing was the sole legitimate government of China, and that Taiwan is part of China, and the important principle being one of non-interference. That is, question of Taiwan will be resolved by the Chinese people themselves. It's not going to be resolved by any foreign powers like the United States or anybody else. So that's the basic political principle behind the one China policy, namely that no foreign interference or aggression in the Chinese Civil War or in terms of China's national reunification will be tolerated.
So is it mainly about Taiwan, or does the one China policy apply to other territories in the region?
Well, it certainly applies to other territories in the region, but the only Taiwan is the central issue. That's Taiwan has the government of the Republic of China, which the U.S. actually recognized during the 1950s and 1960s as the legitimate government of China. It has not recognized at any point any a independent government of any other territory of China.
Mm-hmm. So I think that one of the misconceptions then that we hear a lot, and we see it even in maps. I mean, so when we were working on, we did a video project for something, and we needed to use some stock footage, and all the stock video clips and images that we could find for maps in that area were obviously, I guess, US influenced maps. So you would see Taiwan on the map, and it's implied then by the people who draw these maps that Taiwan is a separate country.
Right. You might call that an imperialist map. Yeah. Now, the one China, the idea that Taiwan is part of China, or that the Taiwan issue will be resolved by the Chinese themselves, that's the basis of diplomatic relations China has with all other countries. And so, around the world, 181 countries recognize the one China principle. Virtually every country in the world recognizes the one China principle. And indeed, the United States also recognizes the one China principle. And even President Biden recently at the G20 in Indonesia clearly stated that the United States still recognizes the one China principle. But the issue here is white man speaketh with forked tongue. Biden says he recognizes the one China principle, but in his actual deeds, he does everything he can to undermine the one China principle. So that's the problem. So that's the issue.
So let's get into that a little bit. Then the official status from the U.S. is that Taiwan is a part of the People's Republic of China, but the actions of the U.S. are in conflict with that. So what types of actions are we seeing from the U.S. and from the Biden administration, or just in general, that contradict with that?
Well, so the one China principle is a principle of diplomacy, of international law, but it does not affect, for example, economic or cultural relations. So China has no problem with the U.S. or any other country having economic relations with Taiwan or cultural, educational exchanges. But the problem is when the U.S. promotes Taiwan as in effect, an independent country equal to China. So that, for example, when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, a few months ago, causing a major sort of international issue. Well, Nancy Pelosi is a high-level government official. In fact, she's right behind the vice president in terms of succession to the U.S. presidency. So that's the kind of thing that China would object to. They object to high-level U.S. government officials visiting Taiwan on these sort of and being given official receptions by the president of Taiwan as if she were, a high-level U.S. diplomat. That's the kind of thing that China objects to. It also objects to the agreements for reestablishing diplomatic relations in 1979 specified that the U.S. should gradually reduce its military aid to Taiwan. You don't give military aid. A government does not sell, large numbers of advanced military equipment to private individuals. That is in effect a government-to-government transaction. And so by increasing the military sales to Taiwan, the U.S. is abrogating the agreement with China, and in fact, treating Taiwan as if it were an independent country. So another example is that the Biden administration is constantly pushing to have Taiwan admitted into international bodies whose members are states and governments, as if it is a state or a government equal to China. For example, recent example would be World Health Organization. The U.S. wants Taiwan to be admitted into the World Health Organization as an equal party like all the other governments and states. Whereas China says it's fine for Taiwan to collaborate with the World Health Organization, certainly, and participate in global efforts to combat COVID and pandemics, but not as an equal state, equal to China. So these are examples of how the U.S. says Biden says that he sticks with the one China principle. He doesn't object or stop to high-level officials going to Taiwan. He increases military aid to Taiwan. And he promotes Taiwan as an independent country in various international bodies.
So let's back up a little bit and assume that maybe some listeners are not familiar with the governments of China and the governments of Taiwan. So you mentioned the Taiwanese president. So what are the distinctions, I guess, between the way Taiwan governs as is it a sovereign government that they have their own constitution and everything like that?
Oh, the Qing dynasty, a 2,000-year-old succession of Chinese feudal dynasties, was overthrown in 1911 by a revolution, which was led by Sun Yat-sen, a democratic revolution supported by the Chinese people, led by Sun Yat-sen, which then established the Republic of China. That's what they called the government after they overthrew the feudal dynasties.
Mm-hmm.
Under Sun Yat-sen, the Republic of China was in fact a progressive and democratic government, but it was also a weak government. And right-wing fascistic elements, after Sun Yat-sen died, took control of the Republic of China government, which then degenerated into a right-wing kind of fascistic type government, which the Communist Party then proceeded to organize the people, in a democratic left revolution to oppose the Kuomintang, which was the political party that Chiang Kai-shek, the successor to Sun Yat-sen, led. So the Republic of China was the government of China from 1911 to 1949, but it was then defeated by the communist forces, who established a new government, the People's Republic of China, in October 1st, 1949. And the government of the Republic of China fled to Taiwan. So you had the Civil War was not yet finished. You had the socialist communist-led forces on the mainland, and you had the right-wing imperialist supported forces on Taiwan. Now, just about every observer thinks that without outside interference, the communist forces, which were overwhelmingly more powerful than the remnants of the Kuomintang forces, would have captured Taiwan, especially with the support of the local people.
Mm-hmm.
However, the U.S. then intervened militarily to protect Chiang Kai-shek on Taiwan Island, which the communist forces did not have the air and naval power to do anything about at that time.
Okay, so that kind of explains where all this contention comes from then. We were, as the United States, protecting the separatists and protecting the nationalist right-wing forces. And had we not done that, the issue may not even exist today.
Right. I don't think there's any question. The issue would not exist if the U.S. had not intervened. Nobody in the entire history of the world ever put forward the idea that Taiwan is an independent country. It'd be like saying Kansas is an independent country. I mean, it just, nobody would even think of it until the United States intervened in the Chinese Civil War in 1950. And that's when the U.S. concocted the idea that Taiwan was really China, or that there were two Chinas, or, Taiwan independence. That all comes from the U.S. intervention, military intervention in 1950.
So then we had, for at least a couple of decades there, between 1950 and 1971, where relations were non-existent, or they were contentious. And so I'm fascinated by that period of time between when this started and then when sort of relations became quote unquote normalized when Nixon went over there.
Yeah, I mean, during the 1950s, that was the period when, the U.S. was opposing the so-called Sino-Soviet bloc, period of harsh anti-communism, and the U.S. did its best to isolate the new PRC government led by Mao and Zhou Enlai diplomatically and economically, and that continued into the 1960s. And China was seen as, in very racist terms, as seen as a communist enemy of the United States.
So what happened to cause that to change?
Well, I think the one thing that happened was just reality. That in particular, after World War II, with the decolonization of, the British Empire, the French Empire, and so on and so forth, we had dozens of new states emerging in, what they called the Third World or the Global South, for example, in Africa and Asia, many of whom recognized the People's Republic as the government of China. And so the U.S. was not successful in isolating China. China was, so big and so powerful. It was asserting itself, and in the United Nations had more and more support. Had clearly had the large majority support, for example, in the UN General Assembly, that the UN seat should go to the People's Republic of China. So I think that was one major. I think that probably was the major reason. It was just a more realistic view that Kissinger had, for example. And the other aspect was that in the Kissinger-Nixon sort of global strategy, they felt that the principal enemy of the United States at that time was the Soviet Union. So their strategy was to normalize relations with China in order to isolate the Soviet Union. So I think that was another sort of imperialist strategy, recognizing the reality of the situation. And imperialists sort of adjusted their strategy to their advantage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that sounds like that could have been a big motivator then, because they were seizing the opportunity and to their advantage. And I wonder what kind of economic advantages there were for the recognition of the People's Republic of China as well.
Well, yeah, of course, there were huge possibilities in terms of a gigantic expansion of trade and investment between the U.S. and China. China at that time was shifting its economic policy from one essentially of pretty much isolation during the Cultural Revolution to policies which recognized that China, in order to develop, would need to engage economically with the rest of the world, and badly needed capital investment, which at that time was going to come mainly from the United States and the West. So the normalization of relations was supported by a very broad range of the U.S. public, including not only, the left, but also educational institutions, cultural institutions, and a large portion of the business community.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like the U.S. was kind of reluctantly dragged along with the UN overwhelmingly recognizing the People's Republic of China. And then also it found some imperialist opportunities to seize upon as well, with the to try to fight against the Soviet Union, which at that time was considered like the number one enemy. So I'm curious then, after that time, when we further into the 80s, and then obviously when the Soviet Union collapsed, did that change things at all? Did that change the relations that the U.S. had with the recognition of the PRC?
Well, so what I would say is that during the 1980s and 1990s, that was, for the most part, a period of relatively normal relations of the U.S. and China.
Mm-hmm.
Tremendous expansion of economic cooperation on many fronts. I can remember when huge numbers of Chinese students and scholars came to the Boston area, because, of course, there are many universities here back in the 1980s, and there were a lot of friendship activities welcoming the students and scholars from China. There's also a huge increase in travel back and forth. Large numbers of Americans going to China, which has a lot of, wonderful sites and cultural heritage and so forth. According to my way of looking at it, I mean, I'm sure there are other ways of looking at it. The real watershed in the change from a normal, relatively friendly U.S. attitude towards China to considering China as a competitor and now as really as an enemy began with the economic, crisis of 2008, 2009, which China emerged out of that crisis. It handled that crisis. It managed that crisis very well. It was very stable compared to the Western, capitalist imperialist countries. And that crisis led to many people, particularly in the global South, looking at China and saying, hey, here we have a stable country which seems to be independent of the Western capitalist system while also engaging in it, that is continuing to grow at a very rapid rate. And I think the U.S. capitalist imperialists looked at that and realized that China was on its way to catching up with, and goodness gracious, maybe even surpassing the United States in terms of economic strength and technological development. So I think that's when the shift began to occur to an anti-China policy, and that was formalized in 2011. Hillary Clinton wrote a well-known essay published, I think, in Foreign Affairs magazine, in which she described a so-called pivot to Asia, in which the U.S. strategy would shift, pulling resources out of various places in the world, particularly the Middle East, and redeploying them into East Asia, and adopting, in effect, a strategy of surrounding China militarily and diplomatically. So I think it's after the 2008, 2009 economic crisis that U.S. imperialism began to recognize the challenge that it perceived that these very successful socialist state in China in the long term posed to U.S. capitalist imperialist hegemony, and decided that it needed to shift its strategy to stop China's rise.
So they began to see it as a threat.
Yes, and see it as a threat. China does not regard the United States as a threat. It wants to have normal relations with all countries in the world. That's it. That's its perspective. They talk about the global, what do they call it, the global community. Or so China thinks that all the countries of the world should cooperate, especially through the United Nations, and particularly, opposing things like environmental destruction, global warming, global health, pandemics, stopping war, economic development, particularly for the least developed countries. I mean, that's China's official position. Now, you can examine that and see how it's being implemented, but that is their official position. Peace and development and green environment for all the countries in the world. Now, I think that many countries in the global South look at that, and then they look at the current U.S. policy, global policy, which perceives the struggle between the democracies and the authoritarian countries. That's how the U.S. sees it, whereas China sees it as the need for global cooperation on all these important global issues. And so more and more countries in the global South are looking at those two professed policies, and the Chinese vision, for the world is a much more appealing one.
So what do you think is going to happen with the U.S.? Is it going to continue to dig its heels in on this? Or is it do you think we're going to see another kind of realization like we saw in the 70s with Kissinger and Nixon, where we might see better diplomatic relations?
Well, that's a question of, U.S. politics. In other words, U.S. capitalism, imperialism as long as it pursues a policy of global hegemony, is going to see China as more and more of a threat, and from his perspective. On the other hand, if they adopt a more realistic view and start pulling back from the attempt to dominate the whole world and recognize the reality of a multipolar world, we could see much better relations. So that is a role that the left would have, or the peace forces would have, the anti-imperialist forces, the peace forces in the U.S., in the West, would be to push to, cut the military budget and adopt a less militaristic foreign policy.
Because I don't think that U.S. capitalism could survive without China. I mean, when you look at the products manufacturing, it's overwhelmingly coming from China. And so when Trump was in office and tried to put all these new tariffs in place, I'd imagine that probably didn't help the situation with our relation with China, but I imagine that also didn't help the U.S. capitalists. I'm sure they were probably not happy about that either.
Oh, that's right. I mean, there's a split in the U.S. capitalist imperialist camp, if you want to call it that, about how to deal with China. So what you might call the realists or the pragmatists, which would include a large portion of the business community, actually wants normalized relations. On the other hand, more of these sort of those who strategize for empire and hegemony, they see communism as the principal threat. And so they're willing to sacrifice these good business relationships to stop the rise of communism. I mean, that's what the previous Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, he was very clear about, the danger of Chinese communism. And even Hillary Clinton said, do you want your grandchildren speaking Chinese? So I have actually been surprised. I thought the U.S. business community would be more influential in terms of determining U.S. policy. I thought under Biden, you'd see a moderation of U.S. policy because U.S. business interests would be strong in the Biden administration. However, I was wrong on that. So
yeah, I mean, so this is a huge contradiction that we're seeing with, like you said in the beginning, what we say versus what we do. So we say we want good relations. Business community, the capitalists want good relations, probably for exploitative purposes in a lot of cases, but the militaristic view, the imperialist view, is willing to sacrifice all of the economic benefits for imperial gains. So what do you think they want? Like, what is the goal of this particular fringe of the, let's call them hyper imperialists?
They want regime change in China, and they're using Taiwan to try to they're trying to weaponize the Taiwan issue. I don't care. They say we're standing up for democracy in Taiwan and opposing authoritarianism. The reality is they don't care anything about democracy in Taiwan. What they want to do is use Taiwan, along with all these other sort of color revolution, hybrid war tactics for regime change, overthrow the power of the Communist Party in China, and help install a U.S.-friendly government in Beijing. That's what they hope to do.
In 2012, when the new administration in China took over, I know that the U.S. has been putting out a lot of propaganda since that time about this threat of China. I mean, there's a documentary on CNN a few years ago with Fareed Zakaria talking about using real scary, ominous music and footage of the Chinese military. And it was reminiscent of like the Cold War era propaganda that the US had. So they see President Xi as this authoritarian dictator. That seems to be the source of a lot of the propaganda that we're seeing coming from the US. And then we have organizations like Victims of Communism. And what is it about President Xi that the US feels so threatened by?
Well, I think whoever the leader would be subject to this type of propaganda. I think it's more of a shift in policy after the 2008-2009 economic crisis. I mean, as far as Xi Jinping, I think he's a very strong leader. like more or less on the level of Deng Xiaoping, you might say. I don't think anybody would quite be on the level of Mao Zedong, but he is a very strong leader, and so that's why they're focusing on him. But I think that even if there were another leader, they would still have this anti-China propaganda campaign, because any leader of China, including actually even the Kuomintang also believes in a one China policy. So any leader of China is going to maintain a one China policy, or maintain that they will not accept any outside interference in China's affairs.
So this is one of those things that there are the war hawks here in the US that would see no problem with the US sending troops and invading, going into an all-out war with China. But then you've got, I guess, the moderates that are saying, let's slow down a little bit, because that's an enormous country with enormous resources, and it would lead to World War III. And there was speculation that World War III was just around the corner a few months back when Pelosi went to Taiwan. How close do you think we are to a potential armed conflict situation?
Well, certainly there is a risk of conflict, particularly the U.S. pushing all of these military exercises, showing its air sea power in the Taiwan Straits and so forth. But you also have to remember that the Taiwan Straits, or Taiwan's, about 8,000 miles from the U.S. mainland, and is right off the coast of mainland China. So China has also modernized a lot of still in the process of modernizing its military. It doesn't think it will catch up to the U.S. in terms of military power, maybe until mid-century, but it does have a lot of capabilities. For example, the Chinese military has a system of land-sea missiles, which are positioned to strike at U.S. aircraft carriers and ships and so forth, which it didn't have in 1950. So the Pentagon has done many war games of, what if there's an actual war breaks out in the Taiwan Straits or over Taiwan. Of course, these are games, they're not like scientific, but I think most of the war games would, even that the Pentagon does, turn out that if the conflict between the U.S. and China is restricted to the area around Taiwan and Taiwan Straits and so forth, that there's a very good chance, the odds are that China would actually defeat the U.S. military. I mean, there are different considerations. The U.S. still has a much more modernized military capacity, and the U.S. has a huge advantage in any military conflict and experience, having fought many wars. It knows how to use its equipment and so forth, whereas China has very limited experience in fighting wars or modern wars. So that would be a big advantage for the United States. On the other hand, a huge advantage to China is that China has exactly one overseas base, a small base in Djibouti in Africa, whereas the U.S. military spread all over the world. It has something like 800 military bases globally. So this would enable the Chinese to concentrate a large portion of their military power in any war in the Taiwan Straits or around Taiwan or the South China Sea. And so China would not only be able to concentrate their forces, they would have huge advantages in terms of logistics, supply chains. They also have, the population China is over 4.5 times bigger than the US. And they would also have a tremendous morale advantage. The whole Chinese nation would rally behind the government in any such conflict. If you run these war games, I think all of them say that the Chinese military would inflict a huge amount of damage to the U.S. military. And in any protracted war, the longer the war goes on, the more the advantage would shift to China. So people who worry about nuclear war, I think the concern is that the logic of the U.S. military in any war with China over Taiwan is that the military logic would say that for the U.S. to bring its strengths to full advantage, it would need to escalate the war, for example, by bombing bases on the Chinese mainland. So once you start escalating the war, where does that stop? Does that mean the U.S. will start using tactical nuclear weapons and so forth? So, I think the U.S. main strategy, and this is all just my opinion, is to focus on overthrowing the Chinese government by a so-called color revolution. So that's what's behind all of these U.S. support separatist activities all around China, in Xinjiang and Tibet and Hong Kong, as well as in Taiwan. That the classic Western strategy led by the British in the 19th century to colonize China there was a general recognition we can't just send an army into China. It's just too big. Mm-hmm. So the classic strategy was to cut off bits of China one way or another and just kind of slowly break it up into pieces and to create a disunited China, which then the Western colonial powers could dominate. Partly succeeded in doing, but actually never did. China was never fully colonized by the West. It always maintained its independence in some form. So I think the U.S. is realistic enough to know that in a war with China, the outcome could well be not good for the United States. So I think the principal strategy is still a so-called color revolution, propaganda, hybrid war, support dissidents in China. I think that's mainly what it's trying to do. The people who actually want a war with China, I think, are still in a minority.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a terrifying hypothetical to even think about. One can hope that there would be enough backlash in the U.S. against something like this, but it's kind of hard to know for sure, because the peace movement, for what it's worth, I mean, it's not worth much in this country anymore. I mean, we don't have the same level of a peace movement. It's almost non-existent. So as a peace activist yourself, are you optimistic that this is something that we can avoid?
Well, I think that the peace movement needs to be rebuilt. And this is something that the CPUSA is talking about. And I think will this year take some initiatives and needs to be rebuilt on a sort of much broader basis, which would include the justice and solidarity movements. So you would have a peace, justice, and solidarity movement, which would be much more rooted, if successful, in rebuilding the peace movement, creating a new peace movement, which would have much stronger roots in the people of color and working class organizations and people. So in terms of being optimistic, well, I don't know, but if I think China's influence is growing, especially in the global South, with programs like the Belt and Road Initiative, I think are pretty successsul in building infrastructure in a lot of different countries, and particularly in Asia, Africa, Latin America. So I don't know. I mean, I think that the U.S. strategy, I don't think it's a very smart strategy. I think it's kind of stupid strategy.
Yeah.
If I were advising U.S. capitalism, imperialism on the best strategy, I would, in dealing with China, I would say pull back from all these sort of militaristic, confrontational type activities and build up your strength at home. That's what I would advocate. So instead of trying to stop Huawei, the highly successful global Chinese IT company, if you want to call it that, instead of trying to stop it, you should build up your own capacities at home. So that would just be, one example, because if you look at what the Communist Party of China, the obstacles that they've overcome in their 100 years of existence, they have grown from like 24 people at the first meeting in Shanghai in 1921. There's now 95 or 100 million party members. They have overcome incredible obstacles. And I think the U.S. capitalist imperialists are lost in their own arrogance and hubris to think that they're going to stop China from rising. They're particularly alarmed by China's great progress in advanced technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics, all kinds of different advanced technologies where the Chinese are matching and starting to lead. Space exploration would be another one, the U.S., because the U.S. relies on its technological superiority for its military muscle. I think it's an illusion to think that you're going to stop China from achieving a very advanced economic and technological situation. If you look at 2,000, 3,000 years of history, China has usually been at the forefront of global science and technology. That's the normal situation, matching or surpassing Europe and the West. It's only since, the Opium War in the last 150 years or 200 years or whatever, China's fallen behind. But the historical track record is that they will catch up. They will definitely catch up with the U.S. economically and technologically. So if I were a smart capitalist imperialist, I would recognize that and anticipate that and try to make some adjustments to it rather than trying to stop it. Because interestingly enough, the U.S. is starting to self-isolate in terms of, its global economic and, technological engagement. And, the Chinese already are starting to advance. To a situation where the U.S. should start learning from China. And if it doesn't do that, the U.S. is going to start falling behind. So
it's almost like it's just a big ego thing where we feel like we're not the big kid on the playground anymore.
Yeah, right. Now there's a multipolar world. Now you got half a dozen or 10 or 12 kids on the playground that are just as big as, becoming as big as strong as you are. So do you continue to try to beat them all up, or do you recognize that this is a new reality and that we're just going to have to back off our sort of drive for global dominance? And yeah, it is kind of like a big ego thing.
Duncan, I could talk to you all day about this, and there's so much to cover. Where can people listening, where can they go to get more information? What's going on between the US and China? Because they can't go to the New York Times, obviously. They can't go to CNN. Where can people go to find out more?
Yeah, they can't go to the liberal media. The New York Times and CNN are two of the leading anti-China sort of propaganda vehicles, pro-war propaganda vehicles. I think the fact that the liberal capitalist imperialists are now this sort of primary pro-war kind of faction has confused a lot of the peace movement. So what I would advocate is go to what's called Duncan News Weekly Report, DONGSHENG. I think that's a good starting point for getting a Chinese perspective on the news, and which is actually much more objective than the U.S. media. And it's put out by a collective. It's not actually a Chinese government organization. That's what I would recommend as a starting point. They also, Duncan News also has a weekly report called Chinese Voices, in which they reprint different kind of articles from the Chinese press. All this is in English.
And then what can we look forward to this year coming from the Peace and Solidarity Commission, and specifically the Asia-Pacific Subcommittee?
The Asia-Pacific Subcommittee is going to be co-sponsoring, at the initiative of the International Department, a series of discussions on various issues concerning China today. So one thing people might, need to put a little bit of work into this. You're talking about China is 1.4 billion people and thousands of years of history. It's actually older and bigger than Western civilization. So you're talking about a whole civilization.
Mm-hmm.
But the next thing that I'm going to be studying, the next event in China, is the meeting of the National People's Congress in March. That's one of the Chinese call them the two meetings. Annually, you have a meeting of a central committee meeting of the Chinese Communist Party, which sets policy, political direction, and then the implementation of that policy is carried out by the government of the People's Republic of China. And its annual meeting is called the National People's Congress. So that's where a lot of the implementation of the political decisions happens. So the party has set the goal, for example, of that China will be carbon neutral by 2060. Some people think it should be sooner than that. Maybe I think so too. But so that's the goal. But how are you going to do it?
Right.
So the party sets the goal, but the National People's Congress has actually got to figure out how to do it. So in the implementation of these different political goals, that's the agenda of the National People's Congress. So it's very interesting to see how this stuff actually happens. So I think there's probably going to be a discussion of that, in March or April.
That would be great. And I think that we would love to have you back, potentially do a whole panel about climate change and how international solidarity plays a crucial role.
Yeah. Very, very important issue, obviously.
Well, is there anything else you wanted to share or promote that's coming up, or any other topics or areas you wanted to mention?
I don't think right at this moment.
Well, thanks again for doing this. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks to Pants on Fire.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Duncan, and we'll talk soon.
Okay. Yeah, let's talk soon, Kyle.
Thank you for listening to Pants on Fire, Exposing Ruling Class Lies, the podcast produced by the International Department of CPUSA. Visit our website, cpusa.org, to learn more about the party. Follow us on Twitter at CPUSA Department, and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast app.